Chapter 4 The State, War, and Empire. I'm an anarchist because states kill and conquer. Their militaries cause unbelievable destruction, and through a combination of military force, the use of dirty tricks, and the application of economic pressure, they dominate less powerful societies. Take an obvious example close to home. The U.S. government's declared and undeclared wars are too often exercises in unjust imperial expansion. Empire building takes military, political, and economic forms. The government's wars are frequently imperial because they serve to extend its military power around the world, creating new alliances, new opportunities to locate bases and troops at every turn, making clear who's boss to anyone who might get out of line, and because they often seem calculated to extend the influence of American big business. Similarly, the U.S. government's wars are pointless because they don't actually make Americans safer. Military interventions in Korea, Vietnam, Lebanon, Grenada, Iraq, the Balkans, Somalia, and Afghanistan haven't served to protect Americans against foreign attacks. They increasingly breed hostility towards the U.S. government and too often violence against Americans. They don't spread American ideals, they tarnish them. Widespread collateral damage to non-combatants doesn't help. And U.S. government military interventions typically serve not to create or strengthen free societies, but to shore up authoritarian regimes more popular with decision-makers in Washington because of their cooperative attitudes than because of any genuine commitment to the freedom and prosperity of their society's people. War and moral equality. The threat of violence is the primary source of the state's internal power, but states repeatedly engage in violence outside their supposed borders. The most basic anarchist moral conviction, I think, is that no one gets a free pass where morality is concerned. If it's unjust for you to do something in a given set of circumstances, then it's unjust for me to do the same thing in relatively similar circumstances. By contrast, the state seems to operate on the premise that, once in possession of the right sort of mandate, people can morally do all sorts of things they couldn't do otherwise. For anarchists, though, the fact that the state has ordered someone to do something doesn't, per se, change the moral circumstances in which she acts. Thus, anarchists will tend to agree with Mark Twain's acid observation that all war, here he clearly means the kind of aggressive war in which states most frequently engage, must be just the killing of strangers against whom you feel no personal animosity, strangers whom, in other circumstances, you would help if you found them in trouble, and who would help you if you needed it. Otherwise, immoral conduct doesn't become acceptable when it's ordered by the state. That's why anarchists say such a decisive no to war. Some anarchists are pacifists, but most believe that the use of force to defend oneself or others against violence is perfectly reasonable. States, however, recognize no such limitation. They wage war to dominate, threaten, retaliate, and conquer. And this kind of war makes no sense from an anarchist perspective. If state actors don't get any sort of exemption from the requirements of justice, what entitles them to attack and destroy when ordinary people can't do the same thing? We'd respond in horror if ordinary people began attacking their neighbors, occupying their homes, making off with their possessions, confining them, and demanding tribute from them. But states do this kind of thing all the time. Once we see through the state's deceptive self-presentation, once we realize that state actors are just, as it were, your neighbors with guns, ordinary people with no more claim to authority than you have, we can see that there's no reason to go along with the state's aggressive wars or to regard them as anything but exercises in brutality. Dispelling the fog of war. There are all sorts of good reasons to oppose the state's war machine. Most fundamentally, wars kill. States enslave prospective soldiers and exact tribute from people in order to fund their war machines. Wars give states excuses to expand their power. Wars lead to more wars, and they break up families and communities. Wars kill. To restate the obvious, state violence kills. Before the 20th century, state violence, which includes more than declared wars, but which will have been the work of either military personnel or of others acting under the state's orders, likely claimed between 89 million and 260 million lives. Reasonable estimates place the total number of war-related deaths in the 20th century alone at over, possibly well over, 100 million people. Perhaps 15 million people died in or as a result of World War I. World War II may have claimed some 50 million lives. To focus more on recent events, documented non-combatant deaths in Iraq since the 2003 invasion total around 100,000. Over 31,000 U.S. government military personnel have been wounded in action. More than 4,200 military personnel and over 1,100 contractors have been killed. Wars lead to the extraction of tribute. Wars generate ballooning costs that feed a bloated state bureaucracy. It's not easy to estimate costs for war throughout history, but World War I cost the participants some $2.6 trillion in today's dollars, while the inflation-adjusted bill for World War II seems to have been around $3.3 trillion. A Congressional Research Service, or CRS, analyst estimates that the United States government spent $341 billion in today's dollars on the Korean War and $738 billion in today's dollars on the Vietnam War. And this ignores various indirect and non-monetary costs, as well as financial costs not borne by Americans. We can't be certain just how much Americans will ultimately pay for war in Iraq and Afghanistan and for foreign military base security upgrades initiated since the September 11, 2001 attacks. But a recent CRS estimate suggests that expenditures approved from fiscal year 2001 through the middle of fiscal year 2010 totaled $1.12 trillion. That's roughly $400 per American per year, or $1,600 for a household of four. And remember that U.S. government war efforts are being paid for with borrowed money. The bill will be even higher when it finally comes due. Take a variety of indirect costs into account, and the hit to Americans' pocketbooks looks worse yet again. In fact, two economists, Linda Bilmes and Joseph Stiglitz, have argued that the total costs of war in Iraq and Afghanistan could reach at least $3 trillion and will likely be higher than that. Barack Obama has announced the end of combat operations in Iraq, but some 50,000 U.S. government troops remain, and the president and congressional leaders remain committed to a protracted war in Afghanistan. There's no end in sight, and the bills just keep adding up. George Bush and Dick Cheney may be out of office, but the war party, made up of the people, whatever their party affiliations, who favor using war to achieve the state's imperial goals, is still in power, and it's still spending what grandiose would-be wise men like to call blood and treasure. Wars create excuses for the abuse of power. Wars create new opportunities for the abusive exercise of power. Revolutionary War-era state governments created conscription programs and executed deserters without trial. Would-be warmongers passed the Alien and Sedition Acts at the end of the 18th century to suppress criticisms of policies with the potential to lead to war. Both sides in the Civil War implemented conscription programs and imposed criminal penalties on vocal dissenters. During World War I, Woodrow Wilson promised that a firm hand of stern repression would be used against putatively disloyal opponents. The United States government rounded up domestic radicals in large numbers, prosecuting people just for expressing opposition to the war. World War II provided military and political leaders in the United States with excuses to intern people simply because of their Japanese backgrounds, without any determination of individual risks, and anti-sedition legislation provided cover for crackdowns on free speech. Cold War prosecutions and persecutions of leftists with no actual involvement in espionage or in Soviet plans for imperial expansion are painfully well known. Vietnam-era groups opposed to the state's Southeast Asian adventurism were targeted by law enforcement agencies for infiltration and manipulation, and people were prosecuted simply for the symbolic act of burning draft cards. War still provides excuses for human rights abuses. Before George Bush announced a global war on terror, had you ever heard of waterboarding or extraordinary rendition? Did it ever occur to you that agents of the U.S. government would force defenseless prisoners to feel like they were drowning? Did you think U.S. government personnel would capture people and hand them over to agents of foreign governments who would beat and torture them? Did you imagine that money you paid in taxes would be used to create black sites around the world, purportedly outside the Constitution's reach, where prisoners could be held without trial? Since the United States became involved in a perpetual aggressive war, using the military to address a law enforcement problem, we've all become better acquainted with the slick euphemisms the government can use to hide brutality. Some of the worst abuses of the Bush years may be over, but Barack Obama's inaugural address told us that Bush's war on terror wasn't over. The Obama administration apparently has no intention of prosecuting Bush-era torturers. The theoretical possibility of trials may still be on the table, but there's no realistic chance they'll actually happen. There's some reason to think its newly announced rules preclude torture by U.S. government workers, but not necessarily by foreigners at U.S. government sites. The administration seems to be using carefully crafted rhetoric to distance itself from its predecessor's awful human rights record, while still keeping its own options open. And of course, the problem doesn't stop at the water's edge. Is there anything more fun than waiting in an airport security line for a humiliating search? Do you like knowing that guards are keeping your friends and family members from walking through security checkpoints with you to your departure gate? Aren't you glad to know that government agents have been listening in on American cell phone calls? Or issuing national security letters demanding people's private information while prohibiting anyone from revealing the fact that they've obtained it? Freedom was the first casualty of the American state's undeclared war. As a senator, Barack Obama supported reauthorization of the USA Patriot Act, despite the fact that he had earlier noted civil liberties problems with the law. And he signed up for the FISA Amendment Act, which purported to make warrantless wiretaps legal. Just be glad Congress can't change the Constitution, and gave telecoms a free pass for helping out with the Bush administration's domestic surveillance program. War gives the state the excuse to hide information from the public. Not so long ago, the Department of Justice argued that because a case involves state secrets, the entire case should be dismissed. It said the government's claimed state secrets privilege could justify keeping the government itself from being sued. That's the Obama Department of Justice. During his presidential campaign, Obama criticized the Bush administration for its expansive reading of the state secret privilege. Now, his DOJ is taking the same position as its Bush-era predecessor. The government claims it needs the state secrets privilege and other secrecy rules to keep us safe from our adversaries in the war on terror. But the principal effect of secrecy rules is keeping us from holding the state accountable. They make it easier for fraud, violations of civil liberties, and torture to go undetected and unremedied. Randolph Bourne famously observed that war is the health of the state. The war party uses the endless war on terror, which does little to keep Americans safe, but which does foster intense anti-American sentiment by casting the U.S. government in the role of a global bully, as an excuse to justify the abuse of human rights, the erosion of freedom, the wasteful expenditure of our money, and the expansion of executive power, hiding abuses from view by appealing to the value of state secrecy. In wartime, the state seeks to silence or marginalize dissenters, dismissing those who oppose the official story as unpatriotic or even traitorous. Dissidents are branded as dangerous, put on watch lists, ridiculed, and harassed. They may not be imprisoned, as some were during World War I, but establishment cronies and apologists in the mainstream media treat them as silly, naive, and so obviously wrong that they may be effectively silenced. Their voices inaudible to most ordinary people. Violence leads to more violence. Wars lead to even more violence. Military intervention and political manipulation in the Middle East, most recently the two-front war in Iraq and Afghanistan, has led to passionate antipathy to the U.S. government across the region and the Muslim world. Ongoing terror campaigns don't reflect some mythical distaste for American decadence. They're focused intensely on the goal of dislodging U.S. government soldiers and military investments from the region. Public statements identified as originating with the al-Qaeda terrorist network consistently justify terrorist attacks as responses to military action, to the U.S. government's long-term ongoing intervention in Iraq, for instance, and the presence of its armed forces in Saudi Arabia. Remember when Secretary of State Madeleine Albright famously said that maintaining an embargo that led to the deaths of Iraqi children was, quote, worth it, unquote, because it contained Saddam Hussein? Would you guess that it boosted pro-American sentiment in Iraq? One of the defendants in the 1993 World Trade Center bombing case said the same thing. The 2010 Times Square would-be bomber made the same point again. All purposeful or indiscriminate attacks on non-combatants are wrong. There are no exceptions. But terrorist violence directed at American targets is explicable. It's not a product of visceral hatred for American freedoms, nor is it part of some sinister master plan for the conquest of the world. It is a direct response to perceived injustice and the violence of war. Wars break up families and communities. Wars break up military families. The mobility required to make a standing army work puts enormous pressure on family life. It also makes communities unstable, as military personnel with a lot to contribute to their communities are unable to put down the roots they need to invest emotionally and financially in their communities. Ironically, many of the same conservatives who trumpet their pro-family credentials seem unconcerned that their support for a bloated military establishment comes at a high price for many real-world families.